Hello, everyone. I'm Brandon Lewis here with Congressman John Rose, and we're going to talk about some Tennessee policy issues and also Mr. Rose's upcoming run for governor. Thank you so much for taking time to meet me
Yes,
up here
good
in
to meet
D.C.
you.
and showing me around. Well, talk to us a little bit about why you're running for governor in Tennessee, and then also talk to us about why you and why now.
Sure. Well, I'm a conservative outsider, a Christian, husband, father, farmer, a small business owner. I ran for Congress 8 years ago because I was worried about the future of the country. And it's a similar concern that's motivating me now. I'm concerned about the future of Tennessee. The concerns are a little different. Obviously, here at the national level, we have runaway spending, exploding federal debt and deficit, and really a challenge to, I think, the future of the country. Thankfully, back home in Tennessee, because of generally good leadership over the years, Tennessee's in a much better place. But we're blessed to have low taxes, the lowest debt per capita of any state in the country, low regulations, a hospitable business climate, a hospitable social climate, and people are flocking to Tennessee. But as we see, that's creating challenges, and I'm convinced that if we don't have the right leadership, conservative, principled leadership over the next 8 years, that we may find Tennessee in the wrong place, and we may lose the character and nature of Tennessee. The values of Tennessee may be lost in all of that growth and that change and new people coming. And so that's really the overarching goal, is to try to preserve what makes Tennessee special and keep Tennessee on track. And I feel like my years of building businesses, from the idea phase to conception to success, signing the front side of a paycheck, operating a successful farming operation, those are the kind of executive skills, leadership skills that I think the governorship calls for. I've learned a lot being a legislator over the last 6 or 7 years. This has been my only real service as an elected official, and serving as a legislator is a very different proposition than leading an organization. So the role of governor and the role of being a legislator are very different roles, and so I feel like my life experience leading up to now is probably better suited for me to make a meaningful contribution in a role like being governor of Tennessee, and so that's why I've offered myself as a candidate.
Very good. One thing that I've noticed, and we've looked at studies, most of the folks that are moving to Tennessee that are coming, that are not moving because of vocational reasons, are selecting the state as their primary residence rather. Like, they're very conservative. They're more conservative on average than your typical GOP primary voter. And what I have found over the last 5 years, I guess, running the Tennessee Conservative, is when you poll the GOP primary voters, they're a lot more conservative on most issues on average than your average GOP politician. Like, they're just to the right of them pretty substantially. One of the key issues is illegal immigration. It is the number one issue when you poll people in our state, kind of tied with the economy, but it's the most visceral issue. It's the easiest to understand. People don't have there's no black and white on it, but I think it's like 90 some odd percent don't want us to be funding illegal immigrant education. But here recently in the legislature, like, it was all we could do to get a bill through committee for a 95% issue. Mass transportation, E-Verify, all kinds of issues that we could have solved for the last 5 years, but I've just watched them be routinely killed, and we've had no real leadership from the governor's mansion on illegal immigration. What would you do on this topic? What practical issues, what practical policies would you have? Because there just seems to be a misalignment between where the GOP primary voters are and then what they're getting from the governance standpoint on that issue.
Sure. Well, so I consider myself to be conservative, very conservative. I'm a fiscal conservative and I'm a social conservative. As to the issue of immigration, I would start, just because I think it's always a good place for Republicans, and particularly conservative Republicans, to start, to say that I'm not anti-immigrant. In fact, I think most conservatives would tell you, I think immigration has been great for our country, and most of us are either descendants of immigrants or immigrants in some way. So we should start there, and we should note that the U.S. accepts more legal immigrants every year than any country in the world, and it's been that way for a long time. And that's great. And another observation I would make is that throughout the entire history of our country, even before the Republic was established, we've always produced more opportunity in this country than we've been able to produce people to take advantage of that opportunity. And that's a phenomenal track record that the United States has. So we start there. But then I think as conservatives, would all agree that if you want to come to this country, you should sign up, embrace our values, and come legally. And that's a sometimes arduous process, probably more difficult than it should be. Many of us here in Washington, during the time I've been here, have been advocating for streamlining that process so that it's quicker to get here and immigrate legally. We have too many people standing in line while others are cutting and coming to the state and to the country. And so, I think that's something that we should work on, is trying to make the legal path. And I get involved in that as a member of Congress, because family members come to me and say, I have this person I've married, or this family member, and they want to come here, but they're caught in this system and they can't come. They can't even come and visit in some cases. So we should, I think, attend to that. And that's really more a federal issue than a state issue. The courts have consistently, to the chagrin of many of us, have consistently said it's a wholly federal issue, that the states really don't have a role. We saw that as a real sticking point during the Biden administration, because of the policies of the Biden administration to just open the borders and let people come in. And many of the border states initially, and then other states have tried to say, well, if the U.S. is not going to enforce our border and immigration restrictions, we should do that. So that kind of brings us into the state role. I think obviously there is a state role, because states are put in the unenviable position of having to implement policies and procedures and accommodate the illegal aliens that show up. And maybe one of the most significant flashpoints, there are several, is education. A number of years ago, I think 40 years ago, the Supreme Court ruled that illegal immigrants are entitled to get an education. And so that's kind of tied the hands of state governments and local officials with respect to, if a child of an illegal immigrant or an illegally immigrated child presents themselves to come to school, you have to let them, apparently. That's the law of the land right now. So I think as we've seen, though, the court over time sometimes evolves its thinking, and we've seen so much social upheaval in recent years because of the intentional policy of the Biden administration to let people come to the country illegally, that I think it may be time to see if the court might rethink where they were 40 years ago on this issue. And so I think some favorable legislation went through, what I consider favorable, to allow state and local school systems some choice about the matter. I think everyone expects that's going to end up in the courts, and I think the intention or the hope and thought is that perhaps that provides the occasion for the Supreme Court to readdress that. I think that's appropriate, because I think what the court did years ago, and maybe unintentionally, I think they're probably the motivation, and I haven't read that case in a while, was we don't want people to not get an education. If they're here, the worst possible outcome would be to have them be here and not be educated. That's not good for the country. It's not good for them, and not good for the other people in the country, citizens or non-citizens alike. So that probably was the motivation. What I think probably the court didn't fully fathom is the degree to which that would create a magnet to draw people here. And so I think the state's on the right track. There are other services that are burdened, social services that government provides, in one way or another, or that is provided through other means, like health care, where you have health care providers that are forced to provide health care to illegal immigrants. And these folks, of course, are taking up services that perhaps, I think, without question, should be first available to citizens. And so, some really significant issues. I think the governor has a role in then being an advocate for safeguarding, preserving the resources of Tennessee, safeguarding the sanctity of citizenship, whether that be in terms of government services, whether that be in terms of the right to vote, and making sure that we're not letting illegals dilute the vote of legal citizens. So there's a whole vast array. The unfortunate thing in terms of what state power is that the courts have routinely said that's a federal province, this issue of immigration. And so it's really unfortunate because then states are forced to deal with a lot of the problems that come about because of the mass illegal immigration that we saw happen during the Biden administration.
Well, hopefully we'll see some changes. I mean, it's if you think about it, there's always going to be a lawsuit. Otherwise, Roe versus Wade wouldn't have ever been turned over if we'd not had an opportunity. So often say, well, give it a chance and let's see what happens.
It's funny how liberals are always up for the idea of challenging current precedent, but as soon as they get a favorable liberal outcome from the court, then they think it should freeze right there, and we should not ever, it should never be under assault.
Both sides probably look guilty of that.
Yeah.
So on the issue of illegal immigration transitioning to education, like for example, my daughter, I've got a niece that went to a public school, and her mother enrolled her in kindergarten, and she kept coming home and she wasn't really learning anything. She wasn't really picking up anything, and she's like, "Well, what's going on here? I can't figure it out." And so it turns out that she had to go meet with the teacher, and she said, "Well, over half of my class is Spanish speaking, and I'm having a hard time just teaching these kids how to speak English." And so eventually my niece was withdrawn from that school. And so my sister-in-law decided just to homeschool. Well, this situation is like playing out all over in Chattanooga. You've got schools that are just completely overran. And you look at a lot of the academic achievement continues to be pretty low statewide. And we keep increasing more money. I think recently we did, Bill Lee's voucher program, which costs like $20,000 to give away a $7,000 scholarship, and it's only 5% of the population. But the Tennessee's public schools right now are just not doing the best in the world. What would you see happening that's any different to change what's going on in our schools? Because I run a school for a living. And if you told me that I got the same amount of money and that my coaches could never be fired, and it didn't matter if my students learned anything, but the money kept coming in, I could not reform an organization with that incentive structure. And I don't see how public education can be reformed underneath that incentive structure. So what changes would you see to help reform education in Tennessee so that we can get more value for our dollars and higher customer satisfaction from parents?
Sure. So the good news there is that there has been significant progress made, and we're starting to see I think we're still early in seeing the progress take hold, but every governor in my adult lifetime has made education a priority. So starting with Lamar Alexander, and probably it was true before that. I just am not old enough to fully appreciate that. But certainly since Alexander, and you kind of go through the governors, Republican and Democrat alike have prioritized education or improving educational outcomes as a top priority. And I, too, have that as a top priority, would say it's far and away the top priority. If we don't improve the outcomes for our kids and the success in preparing them for the careers of tomorrow and even the careers of today, then we're not going to succeed as a state. So it has to be number one. And I would say we cannot somehow go around the public schools. Lots of people have chosen to homeschool, and I think that's great. And it's great for parents to have the choices of charter schools, which are still public schools, but a little bit different. And it's great to have private school options. And so I think we want parents to be able to have those choices so they can choose what's best. In the example that you gave, when the public school that they are adjacent to or assigned to or in the proximity of is not getting the job done and imagine that they can't go somewhere else, then we want them to have those options. But at the end of the day, as a policy matter, we've got to improve outcomes for public schools in Tennessee. And so recent indicators are we're making some progress. So the most recent NAEP scores say that we're not only gaining in real terms, we're gaining relatively as well. And that's very positive, so that we're moving in the right direction. And a stat to maybe provide some encouragement is that if over the next 8 years, maybe the term of a new governor, if they got to serve 2 terms, if we got one more student in each class in Tennessee, each classroom in Tennessee, each year, one student in each class each year to attainment levels, and we did that 8 years in a row, we'd suddenly find ourselves in the top 10 in all measures for outcomes for education. So I say that to say improving is, if you kind of break it down and look at it that way, it's a very attainable goal. And I think that improving education is like every other endeavor in life. It takes some vision, it takes some leadership, and it takes the community deciding that it can happen. So the job of the next governor, it seems to me, is to rally Tennesseans around the notion that we need to improve outcomes. If we look at the polling data and the reaction of Tennesseans, many Tennesseans say they're happy with their current public schools. They're happy with the teachers and the administration. And that's understandable because they live in the community with these folks, they're friends with them. But if you look at the outcomes, you can say we probably shouldn't be satisfied with what we're getting from schools. So we've got to change the mindset of Tennesseans, convince them that this needs to happen, number one, and that it can happen, and that they ought to have a vested interest in helping to make it happen. And then I think we've got to inspire our school teachers. I think they can be inspired, and there can be leadership provided there. Help them understand you can help us achieve the goals that Tennessee needs to meet. Clearly define those, and then give them the tools, which I don't think necessarily means a lot more money. It may mean some money in different places and applied in a different way. One of the things that's an interesting accomplishment that Governor Haslam achieved during his time as governor is the opportunity for school systems to have incentive-based pay systems, as opposed to the classic step and ladder system where you get paid simply because of the training you have and the number of years experience you have. Here's the troubling thing. Fewer than 25% of public school systems in Tennessee have embraced that or put in place an incentive-based pay system. So I recently was able to visit with one of the local school directors in our area who has implemented an incentive structure, and guess what? It's working.
Wow.
And so if we could spread that and get more of our public school systems to adopt that, where we actually pay teachers for their success as opposed to just for showing up for work, then, and the interesting thing about the incentive structure, and this is in Trousdale County in Tennessee, Dr. Satterfield, who's their director of schools, has implemented this plan. It's been in place for a number of years, and it's driving outcomes. And it's not just an individual assessment, but there's also a group. He was a coach earlier in his life, and so I think he looks at the world that way of how do you get the team to play together. And so the system that he's put in place and implemented and proven now to work there in Trousdale County is a system where not only does the individual effort get measured, but the group effort gets measured. So there's an incentive for the teachers to come together and work and identify where there are areas for improvement. And it's really inspiring, and it tells me that if we implement a system, so that's, I think, a very tangible thing that a prior governor has made possible through policy changes, and the legislature, of course, involved in that. But we see that it will work. We've just now got to see that it's implemented more broadly.
So another question, this is I think one that a lot of our subscribers would be curious to get the answer to. A lot of folks that are politically involved right now probably woke up in 2020. There's a whole group of people that just never paid attention before. But in Tennessee, that's the reason I got back involved. So I took a political vacation for about 6 years, but then I was sitting at my office illegally working. My church had been shut down. My business was apparently insufficient. The mass work, face it, Tennessee, we spent tax money on that, social distancing. like we've got it pretty wrong, and to watch like our constitutional and civil liberties in Tennessee just get swept aside, and then to watch the legislature not really stand up to the governor in any way. And even now, we've got emergency powers bills that are finally being brought that the governor won't even sign, and no apology ever. We lost 25% of Tennessee small businesses. 25% shuttered because of the decisions that were way overblown. So there are a lot of Tennesseans that are worried that our next governor, I mean, you think, oh gosh, surely we would collectively never lose our minds this much again. Because I was in April of 2020, I was out there saying this stuff can't quite possibly be right. And so where are you on protecting Tennesseans' constitutional rights, even if there is a bad cold, even if there is some kind of emergency? Like, what are your thoughts, generally speaking, on that, and why do you think we maybe got it so wrong in Tennessee? I mean, we got it wrong maybe less, and we got it wrong maybe for not as long, but we were still fooled pretty well. How would you approach that differently now? What are your thoughts and takeaways from that?
Well, I think you're right. I think when we look back at COVID and it was a wake-up call to this country in so many ways, but particularly with respect to our constitutional rights. And so, I think it's a dark chapter, kind of a national nightmare of sorts, from which way we can learn some important lessons. One of those lessons I think we learn is that our constitutional rights have to be kept sacrosanct. And that's true on an everyday basis. So, I think about the First Amendment right to free speech. Mm-hmm. And again, a lot of these were implicated during COVID in various ways, but the right to free speech, the right to assembly, mm-hmm. That was intruded upon. And, the way I look at the world is, the First Amendment is so important that you have the right to say what you want to say. Your role in the press, the media, I think is at an elevated level of importance. But everyone's right to be able to say what they want to say, and the answer for despicable speech or unwelcome speech is not suppression of that, which we've seen, unfortunately, liberals embrace, surprisingly at some level, to see them embrace that. The answer to undesirable, what I might regard as undesirable speech, you may think it's desirable. The answer is more speech, not less speech. And there's a price we pay for that, right? A coarseness, perhaps, at times. We have to hear things that really upset us or that we disagree with strongly and vehemently, but that's not an excuse to suppress that right. It's, in fact, we should lean into it at that point. And if I hear something that someone says that offends me, I should answer that with speech to confront that and to present a different perspective. The same is true, I would say, I'm a big defender of our Second Amendment rights. And so oftentimes when we see people abuse a right, like the First Amendment rights or the Second Amendment rights, and we see that in our society, we certainly see that, the knee-jerk reaction, and I think this goes back into the COVID thing, the knee-jerk reaction is that, well, we're going to have to restrict and suppress and limit those rights. When in fact, it seems to me, we should recognize that, someone may choose to take their Second Amendment right and commit some heinous act. That's not an excuse to then take that right away from everyone else. In fact, I would argue it's a reason to lean into that and say we should defend those rights. And so there's a price for freedom, right? The founders talked about this. Part of that price is that you may have to hear some things that you wish you didn't have to hear. You may have to experience some violence from people who choose to abuse that right that you wish you didn't have to experience. But you don't start with the assumption that, well, someone abuses a right, we're going to take everyone else's rights away. Sometimes the group punishment in school, you had a principal that always was ready to embrace group punishment. Somebody did something bad, he wants to punish the whole class. I think that's probably sends the wrong message. And so with respect to COVID, I think what we saw, sadly, and it was a national phenomenon, is the initial notion was, we've got to, slow down the spread, and we've got to segregate ourselves and shut everything down, and that's somehow going to work. Well, it didn't work, and we now know that. I guess you could say we give everybody a little bit of a pass because we had never experienced anything quite like that, at least in modern time, and certainly not with the modern circumstances that we face. But fairly quickly, it became evident that this is not going right, and we're depriving people of their rights. And the ridiculous outcomes where we had, liquor stores will be open, but churches will be closed. That should have been, it should have really incensed everyone. We should have, been out in the streets protesting that, and a lot of people did. And so, so I think then we have to say, okay, what would we do if we face some similar circumstance? And I would say with respect to COVID, what we learned is maybe from a health perspective, although I think now this is even in question, but maybe from a health perspective, there might be a situation where you needed to segregate or quarantine or whatever you might call. This may be yet another one of those instances, I believe it is, where that might be the best health outcome, but that's not the best rights outcome. Mm-hmm. And so, at least we need to have robust public discussion as voters and our elected representatives. And it's very dangerous. The founders understood this. That's why they created our divided government. It's very concerning when you vest that much power in one person. I sometimes say, democracy, well, it's not my statement, but I quote it, democracy is the most disorganized, inefficient form of government and the worst form of government, perhaps, except for all the others.
Yes.
And so the truth is, our system where we have democratically elected representatives, that govern the state and our republic, it's not necessarily the most efficient, but it actually ends up being, I think, the best outcome driver at the end of the day because everybody gets to have a say in it. And so I think we ought to lean into that as we think about what would those emergency powers, what should they be, and when can they be used, and what will be the process for assessing whether they're appropriate. I think we can all agree. You can imagine a circumstance where government officials need the power to, restrict access to a place or restrict movement for a short while. But we clearly got way over our skis with respect to what happened during COVID. And at the end of the day, perhaps deaths would have been higher in those very early days had we not done some of that, although I think the science now tells us maybe that's not true. Maybe we actually increased the severity of the pandemic by not allowing it to move naturally and allow people to develop immunity. And then clearly we got way off the mark with respect to compelling vaccines and telling people they lose their jobs. I mean, that was all, and that was clear at the time. And I think it illustrates that when you give government officials too much power, their overwhelming tendency will be to abuse that power. So we can't let that happen. And so I think then, there's probably needs to be a very robust public debate in the legislative halls to decide where are those lines. And I think at the end of the day, we need to land on probably allowing the public greater freedom and freedom of choice than is the instinct that will happen during the heat of a crisis.
You've been very kind with your time. I promised your staff that I would not linger long, so I'm going to be good on my promise. If you had any other policy things you'd like to share, if you'd like to ask the audience for your vote, anything like that, I'll give you the last word.
Sure. Well, so I am asking and hoping to earn your vote and support as I seek the governorship in 2026. And what I would say is, as I started, I'm a conservative outsider, a farmer and a businessman, a Christian first and foremost, and a husband and father. And, my aim is to create a Tennessee that is, pays homage to my ancestors and to all of our history as Tennesseans. The great history of Tennessee doesn't just have to be our past, it can be our future. And so we've got to confront the challenges ahead of us. I've experienced the opportunity to be a legislator. It's very different from being a leader and executive. And so the job that I'm seeking is to run Tennessee as its next governor, to make those decisions that the executive officer of the state has to make. And I know from my personal experience that that's very different from being a legislator. It's a harder job. And I know that the job I'm asking for will be the hardest job that I've ever taken on. And so I'm ready to roll up my sleeves and take on that challenge. I'm not doing this to slow down. I think that it will be an opportunity to speed up. And I think I'm at the point in my life where I have the combination of skills and experience and the determination and the vitality to take on this job at this point in my life and do a good job for Tennessee. I've decided there are 5 important issues, and I don't want to take too much time. And so we've already talked about one of those at length, education. I think these are the issues that I would say rise to the top among Tennesseans from what I've learned so far. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But education, infrastructure, including roads, most notably. And I think Tennesseans, you seem to universally share concern about that.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody who's traveled across our state understands what I'm talking about. Access to health care. One of the things I've learned in my current job is that we have a lot of rural counties in particular that lack access to emergency care. And as a result of that, I think it's a real challenge from an economic development perspective for those counties to thrive because businesses don't want to come there. Individuals find it challenging to live in a community if there isn't good access to health care. And then this is kind of an outlier for a state leader to talk about, but increasingly access to energy is a problem. And that's sort of a self-inflicted wound, I will acknowledge, that unfortunately liberals at the national level have been successful in implementing policies with respect to energy that have limited our supply of energy at the very time that we also have a huge new demand for energy being driven by technological developments. And so we've got to make sure that Tennessee has the energy that it needs in order to be able to recruit businesses and jobs for the future of Tennessee. And so the governor's got to have a role in helping to make sure Tennessee can be successful there. And there's good news on that front in that Tennessee is in a good place to be a national leader in the next generation of power generation, which I believe will be small modular reactors, nuclear power. Tennessee already is blessed because of the past successes of TVA to get 40 to 50% of our power from nuclear energy. And so we want to be in the pole position. We are in the pole position. The first small modular reactor in the country has been permitted the site has been permitted at Clinch River near Oak Ridge. And so we need a governor that will continue to provide leadership to make sure we have the energy for tomorrow. And then finally, economic and community development is number 5. And that means recruiting businesses, of course, and it's always a priority, I think, for a governor to lead in that way. What I would say is the twist that I would throw at that is that too many times in the past, we've seen businesses recruited to our state, and then they arrive and they immediately tell us, you need to change.
Yes.
We've got different values from you. Our values are right, yours are wrong. We want you to change to accommodate us. We don't want to be in a position where we attract businesses that come here and then try to change who we are. We should telegraph what our values are. I think we do every day. And we should expect businesses when they come here to embrace those values and roll up their sleeves to be a part of what makes Tennessee great and extend our culture in a way that is reaffirming of the values that we have as Tennesseans. And so those are the top 5 issues in my mind. But at the end of the day, and I will say I've formulated those 5 from the visits I've had with Tennesseans over the last many weeks and months. But I'm not done on that. So I'm hitting the road, traveling across Tennessee. I've been to all 95 counties. I'll be there again. And the goal is to find out what the voters of Tennessee want. What do they want for our state? And so I'll be doing a lot more listening than I will be talking, finding out what Tennesseans value, what they want to see their next governor accomplish for them. And so as I undertake that process, I will also hope to be introducing myself to Tennesseans with the hope of earning the support and ultimately the vote of my fellow Tennesseans. In the end, it's up to them. Mm-hmm. And that's the only poll that matters. Mm-hmm. And their endorsement is the only endorsement ultimately that matters.
Well, very good. Well, I'm excited for your run. I wish you the best. It's hard to run statewide. You're going to have to raise a lot of money and shake a lot of hands and knock a lot of doors and send a lot of mail out. But you're on the beginning of the journey. Good luck.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me as a guest today. It's a great honor and privilege to represent Tennesseans, and I hope to earn your support so that I can continue to work for the betterment of our state not only for the good of all Tennesseans, but in particular for my young boys who are the 9th generation of my family to be in Tennessee. And so hoping to make sure that the lives that they enjoy are enriched by the history that we have and the opportunity to make Tennessee a better place.
Awesome. Well, guys, if you've enjoyed this program, go wherever you get your social media or your podcast, search for Tennessee Conservative. Until next time, I'm Brandon Lewis, signing off.